Welcome to another edition of the Locus Classicus podcast, hosted by myself, Will Carvels, and Michael Brown.
How are you today, Will?
Doing well, doing well. It's a fine afternoon here in Taiwan, hot as ever. How
Well,
about it?
we're just sorry. Go on.
I said, and how about in Australia?
Well, we're just departing winter in Brisbane, and it's getting quite hot. Still a little bit cold at night, but yeah, it's really nice right now. So just enjoying it. And today's topic, we're going to be following on from some of our discussions last week. Are we not, Will?
Yeah, sort of a similar topic, something that we've been wanting to talk about for a long time, I think. This has been now brewing for, I want to say, almost a couple months at this point, and that is the topic of bianzheng lunzhi, which, how should we translate that? If for
So isn't it something like pattern differentiation and determining treatment? It's something like that, you know. Some
yeah,
people have slight nuances to it, or but that's the basic. I'd say that's the basic translation of it. And you know, sometimes people might tweak it a little bit, but you know, that would be a good acceptable translation. I think we can agree upon.
and most people know what we're talking about if we use that term, I think, right? What about
Yes.
bianzheng lunzhi? If you say bianzheng lunzhi, can do people understand that, or is that
In the West, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think I'm trying to recall back to my schooling. It's been a while, nearly 15 years. So,
oh, yeah.
I actually can't. I'm pretty sure that we learned that phrase maybe once or twice, and
Yeah,
then but it was always about like we didn't necessarily talk about that phrase, but it'd always be about kind of differentiating patterns is what we would always kind of like talk about more so in clinic,
I
you
see.
know.
I see.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
So
So that
that's
that would
yeah, same idea.
yeah. We just wouldn't necessarily use the Chinese. And you know, if you came up and spoke to someone, you know, your average Chinese medical practitioner, I'd probably say maybe 50% would know it, maybe 50% wouldn't. I can't really comment on how much it is discussed in America because you know, obviously I'm not there. I didn't do my
Yeah.
training there, so I'm not entirely sure. Maybe when we bring a guest from America, we can kind of like pop that question to them, you know, just give them a little bit of a sneak attack and and
Yeah.
make them recall, you know, their schooling and see if they've got any PTSD from it or anything like
Right.
that that we
Yeah.
might trigger.
Totally. Well, one thing, just before we started, I did want to just thank everyone who kind of gave us some feedback from the last podcast. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to put it up on Facebook too, just because I think it's nice to have some feedback, have some conversation and stuff. Um, Lorraine put some really nice stuff up there with regard to the question of superstition and what superstition was allowed to stay, what was taken out. And so you can check that out on the page.
So
Um,
is it on Scholars or is it on the Academy of Source-Based Medicine? I think it's on the Academy of Source-Based Medicine page, isn't it?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But there was also a discussion on the Scholars of Chinese Medicine Facebook group as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
there was a lively discussion there as well. So that's great. And so I think even if we put it up on one of these Spotify or something like that, it's nice to have that discussion. I hope there will be similar stuff happening after this podcast.
Yeah. I mean, if you guys have been around the major groups of about Chinese medicine on kind of Facebook, you would have seen myself or Will kind of pop up there and maybe give our opinions here and there, either welcomed or unwelcomed opinions, but they're there either way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so if you guys, you know, yeah, if you have feedback for the show, maybe there's an issue you want to talk about, or you want a little bit more, you know, discussion or elucidation on a topic, then yeah, feel free to comment hit us up. We try and engage with the listeners because yeah, it's nice to have that little bit of dialogue and feedback even after we finish recording the show.
Absolutely, yeah. And then we can just sort of like segue it into the next show even and touch on it a little bit, if need be.
We are definitely planning to bring some guests on in the next couple of weeks, so make sure you keep an eye and an ear out for that, because I think we're gonna bring some people in who really have some high levels of expertise as well,
Top-notch
which will be.
talent.
Sorry, say again.
It's a top-notch talent.
Yeah. We've been scanning the playing field. We've been following a lot of these guys since their early years in the rookies, and we like what we see, and we're gonna bring them in.
Yeah. Connoisseurs we are. So I wanted to start out with just like a very, very quick sort of background, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
And so, if you have anything to add here, please just like butt in.
Yep.
But I want to take us back pretty far, actually, to the 1850s. And what happened then was the first Opium War, or sorry, that was the 1830s. And then the second Opium War, I think, was in the 1860s. And this was when China started realizing that they were kind of losing out to the West. And then it really hit home in the 1890s during the first Sino-Japanese War.
Can I just quickly drop one thing though? Like the second Opium War, would you say like China didn't do very well out of that, did they?
No.
And that was kind of and perhaps that combined with that first Sino War, that really kind of made them kind of, how do you say, like feel that the need to advance.
Yeah,
because they'd suffered a few defeats.
Exactly. I mean, they saw that Japan had modernized and industrialized, and so they, a lot of people went over to study in Japan, and in general they just said, all right, Japan has sort of paved the path for Asian countries to take on modernization. And so sort of throughout all layers of society, people were saying, we've got to kind of get rid of these traditional elements that are sort of hampering us, right?
Hindering, impeding. Yep.
And so then part of what happened was Chinese medicine was a target there. You look at someone like Lu Xun, who was like a prominent intellectual. He targeted Chinese medicine directly. A lot of people did that. And so this culminates in 1929 when the Republican government just tries to basically, they come down really hard on Chinese medicine.
Can I just throw one other thing in there? Is that there weren't just people outside of Chinese medicine attacking Chinese medicine, but there were also people within Chinese medicine attacking certain aspects of Chinese medicine as well.
Right.
Which I think is also important part. Like, for example, is it Zhang Taiyan?
Right.
Zhang Taiyan?
Yeah.
Like he tried to get rid of a lot of the Wu Yun Liu Qi and these kind of like extra additional theoretical parts of it as well. Like I'm probably a little bit more familiar with him out of the common people there, but there's still a bit of debates about what should be Chinese medicine, what shouldn't be Chinese medicine, and things like that.
Exactly. And so this kind of goes back to last week when we were talking about we need to examine this idea of, it was the communists who took out all the traditional elements. Well, actually in the 1920s and 30s, going back even further, really, there were people that were extremely critical of five element theory and so forth, even yin-yang theory.
So here's an interesting question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that was influenced by Campo in Japan? Because you had the Qi blood water school, that and kind of the Todo Yoshimasu kind of what do you say, the lineage there were kind of, they were trying to get rid of yin yang wuxing as well, I think.
That I'm not sure on. I mean, I know for sure. I mean, that tradition of like sort of being opposed to sort of the traditional theoretical aspects of Chinese medicine went much further back than the early 20th century for Campo.
Mm,
And so potentially, yes, potentially people that went over to Japan came back, or stuff that they were reading, they were influenced by that. And this kind of comes to my next point, which is in response to, so in 1929 they did have this law. We talked about this actually in the discussion under the podcast last time. And the Chinese doctors were able to sort of successfully defend against that. But then there was a great reckoning about, okay, what are we going to do here? Because, Western medicine is kind of knocking down on the door. And so we need to sort of figure out a way to present Chinese medicine in a way and to practice in a way that can coincide with Western medicine, or can
kind of
show
almost even integrate into the same system, would you say?
integrate into the same system, or maybe some people would even say find a way to prevail over Western medicine and to show your case. And so during that time, one thing that came out was people were basically of the belief that Western medicine was better at sort of identifying diseases because of microscopes and everything else, all of the technology that they have available. And so it became
do you mind if I just tell you a quick funny story about that?
Oh, sure, yeah.
So it's actually by Zhang Xichun, right? Who was one of the early kind of pioneers of what would you say, kind of like integrating Eastern and Western medicine? What something like that term. I can't exactly remember the Chinese term, right? But that's the basic gist of it. I recall that in his book, and once again, I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact title of the name, but it's something like kind of transmissions or essay or hard essay, something like that, And anyway, he recalls a story, I think, of some Western doctors who were talking about Chinese medicine and its inability to, if I recall, identify like a cerebral hemorrhage or something like that, or a stroke,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they were kind of making a little bit of fun of Chinese medicine because they couldn't do that. And so kind of like, Zhang Xichun, he quotes a passage from the Neijing that very much resembles a stroke. And he also kind of says, actually, the only way that these people can identify a stroke is also when they, cut the person's body open and look at the brain as well. This was in the 1930s as well. So, obviously they have methods now, but he was kind of saying, like these people were kind of dismissing Chinese medicine's ability, but really the only way that the Western medicine could do that at time was via autopsy.
Oh, I like that. That's good.
Yeah. And he quotes one of the Neijing chapters, I think, about reversal, where it actually talks about the blood rising up or following the chi and causing like the person to faint and something like that. And he talks in it a little bit about using a lot of mineral herbs to treat people who have failed with Western medicine treatments after strokes and things like that, who had headaches.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And a little bit of a narcissistic self-plug. I did write an article about that.
You did on stroke, didn't you?
Yeah, that's available on
is it Academia?
Yeah, it's on Academia. Yeah. So that's a fascinating story of the sort of change in the ideas about stroke over time, right?
And I think you really, if I recall, you really looked at some really important and influential doctors of that time period. Zhang Shanlei was one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was the big one because he wrote that huge treatise on stroke.
He actually wrote a lot of huge stuff. he was quite a prolific author. His book on pulse is also incredible. He also wrote a commentary on Tianyi's book on pediatrics. He wrote another commentary on Zhongyan Su's book on the Zhang Fu, like about the exterior patterns and things like interior patterns and things like that, hot, cold, excess, stuff like that. Yeah. He also wrote like another one about acupuncture points where he was comparing the Jia Jing, the Tai Su and stuff like that. I mean, he was an incredible scholar.
He was just pumping out material, that guy.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, it's just
Um,
it is incredible some of the amounts of work that some of the Chinese scholars have done.
you have to wonder how they did it.
Oh man, just well, they probably didn't have Facebook or internet or Zoom or anything like that.
Probably not. Yeah, probably.
Uh, Probably not.
Safe to assume. So circling back, so yeah, we had this 1929, things are not going well, right? And
Yep.
then this reckoning. And so then there was this issue with like disease, right? Where it was like, oh, okay, the Westerners, they like identify that better. So what did the Chinese doctors come back with? Well, they basically just said like, well, that's like all well and good that you can identify it, but you're actually pretty bad at treating it. And so if you know you might be able to identify, but we can really treat these things and we have like good results. And at the time, this was actually like a fairly compelling argument because there were a lot of things where Western medicine was just like utterly failing at. And so also at this time, if we go to Shanghai, we have a school that was started by Ding Ganren, and you have two major players there. Well, there are many major players. But you have Lu Yunlei, and then you have Zhang Zigong, and they were both reading Campo at the time to get to your Campo point.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah, you can definitely find a lot about the stuff that they were reading and so forth. And so they were reading this stuff, and they, what they liked about it was they saw how in the in the Campo reading of like Shanghan Lun,
Mm.
these guys were really looking at like formula patterns and doing these like really precise, looking at ways to palpate the abdomen, things about pulse, all these signs that you can look at to identify a formula pattern. And they said, well, you guys so Lu Yun and Zhang Zigong, they basically said, well, you guys have very advanced means of sort of identifying diseases, but we have patterns, and patterns are sort of right at the I think the way Volker Sad put it is it's like at the fulcrum of clinic. Basically, the symptom, because what it does is it marries the symptoms with the formula, right? They're right. As soon as you have the symptoms, you have the formula, you have the treatment strategy. So they said this is much more practical than what the West is offering, right? And of course they also admired that the Japanese had also endured this time of modernization, right, where Campo was under a lot of fire. And so that's sort of like the first chapter, I would say, in this the evolution of bianzheng lunzhi. And it's going to get more interesting, but I would say sort of the forefathers are really Lu Yunlei and Zhang Zigong. Interestingly, Cao Yingfu is also at that school, but you don't see anything about Campo in his books.
Yeah, not that I've recorded. He still seems to be more about Chinese medicine. Not super heavy on the theory as much as others, but still quite heavy.
Well, the thing is that he came up, the first books that he read in Chinese medicine were basically like the collected works of Zhang Zhucong.
Yeah, really, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, so
that would have been a great introduction to the medicine, and a heavy one.
very, very heady, very, very heady. And you imagine that's the first Shanghan Lun books that he read, and obviously Zhang Zhucong, he goes he uses Wu Yun Liu Qi, so it's actually really hard to understand compared to other commentators, in my opinion.
Well, he kind of, I think, is almost like trying to integrate almost every aspect. Like he uses the Benbiao Zhongqi.
Yeah.
As a way, because to me, I think if I recall, he was trying to figure out, well, why are there hot and cold patterns in Taiyang. And his basic argument is because of the Benbiao Zhongqi is that they share the qi between Taiyang and Shaolin,
Yeah,
between
exactly.
cold water and what do you say, like fire heat.
Yeah, Xiaoyin sovereign fire, right, is the
Mm,
middle chi of Taiyang.
mm,
So this is the interesting thing, is that who was studying under Lu Yunlei and Zhang Zigong? None other than Ren Qiu and Qin Wei. And so I
mm.
apologize for like the amount of Chinese names in here. Is probably a lot for people to take in. But as
Well,
we
I
were
think
saying,
most people should know Chinbo Wei because if I recall, he has two books translated into English, whereas I don't believe Renning Cho has had any of his translated into English.
oh, okay. All right.
Yeah,
So
I,
basically, if we just remember the names, Lu Yunlei and Zhang Zigong, these are like the forefathers in Shanghai. And then we get to the second generation. This is importantly, this is in the 1950s, is Ren Qiu and Qin Wei.
yeah.
Hopefully that's not too much to,
We'll,
I mean,
we'll put him below the description in the podcast on YouTube as well if you're really interested.
yeah, I think it's good to know. I mean, these are like incredible names, like some of the most important names in the 20th century. So,
Well,
um,
Renning Chill has something like I own his complete works, and it's nearly 7,000 pages. I think
right.
I would argue that he is probably the most prolific author of Chinese medicine that I know of, and probably the most historical one is the Wang Kanting. But anyway, but yeah, he just wrote everything, and he was kind of almost responsible, I think, for starting up the Gejia Shui Shuo, which is kind of like the study of different schools of the medicine.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, that came out in the the 1960s, I think.
Mm.
And so, wow, the time is flying by here. We only have 10 minutes on this. So then in the 1950s, what happens is, well, first of all, Chinese medicine really gets this breath of fresh air, this new lease on life, you can say, due to the communists in 1954 deciding that they're just going to go hard on promoting Chinese medicine. And so that happens in the you can read about that in Kim Taylor's work.
Yep,
Um,
yep.
and so this was after about 20 years of civil war, civil war, war with
Mm.
Japan, war with the invading powers, and then we're also finally war
Well,
with
Civil War as well, almost.
yeah, civil war, and then war with Korea.
Yep.
And so this was this so the country was kind of in disarray. There wasn't a lot of time to be studying medicine, really. Obviously, there wasn't a lot of building of the ranks and so forth, and the number of doctors was actually on the decline. And
Mm.
so I think I'll just share a detail from Kim Taylor's book, which I thought was cool. Was they hold this first Congress in 1954 in Nanjing, and the doctors that were there were so, and Cheng Danan was really presiding over that, and the doctors were so excited that many were moved to tears because they thought, oh God, like finally we're getting some recognition here. We can start to really build back our infrastructure as a medicine, right?
Yep, yep.
And so then what happens is um, they're sort of tasked. Mao has certain ideas, but they're sort of tasked with doing this new medicine and bringing the Chinese medicine into the system, right? Into the medical system. It had been outside of the medical system. Now they're going to bring it into the national healthcare system, but they need to contextualize it for the the Marxist intellectuals,
Mm.
for the cadre, and for Mao himself, and for the people. And so Renning Qiu in 1956, starts publishing articles about bianzheng lunzhi.
Mm.
And what's important to understand is that these articles are almost expressly about the Shanghanlun, and the Shanghan Zabinglun, the Shanghanlun, the Jingguiyao, and their method of formula pattern, right?
Yep.
So that's something people need to understand. When Bianzheng Lunzhi was coming on the scene, it was in the context of the Shanghanlun and jingfang. Okay. And so that's a result of these forefathers who are looking at Campo and who are, big jingfang guys themselves in their 30s.
I mean, each of those guys, I think that we're talking about, have probably would know the Shanghanlun very, very well.
Oh yeah.
Each of those guys would probably almost know it, front to back. I can definitely say that about Renning Chu, Cheng Danan, and I would imagine Qinbo Wei, when he was studying under Chao Fu, I don't think Chao Fu would have let him get away without, being able to recite the Shanghanlun. They even talk about Qinbo Wei. They call him something like Neijing Qin because he could almost recite any Neijing passage.
Wow.
So, so the Shanghanlun is probably kind of, like pretty not that difficult for him if he can remember the Neijing.
No, that's just like, yeah, that's nothing.
Yeah.
And so these guys, they really knew their stuff. And as you say, then Qinbo Wei, he wrote an article on Bianzheng Lunzhi, Fang Yaozhong. And so these guys, they all did it in the context of formula pattern and in the jingfang. And so they're sort of arguing the same thing. Listen, that what they're saying is this is a methodology that distinguishes us from Western medicine. It's something that's been a part of the medicine since the very beginning.
Yep.
And it's the essence of the medicine, and it's this ability to what they really extolled about it was the fact that it's based upon the person's constitution, their what they would call in Marxism their contradictions, the actual situation of their body in the time of the disease. And so it's a layer before disease that and looking at how it disposes someone to disease, and then also how it's manifesting, right? So,
and would you say that these were all things that kind of like Western medicine either neglected or ignored or weren't really taking part in it, so it kind of allowed Chinese medicine to also say, hey, we've got all these other things that Western medicine doesn't have, and we can kind of, how do you say, like almost like we still have something to offer,
Yeah. I think that's what it was, and it was basically due to more or less this discovery and this sort of discussion that happened with Zhang Cigong and Lu Yuanlai. That's my opinion on it. Okay, and so that's basically it. That's all the understanding that we need to have. Obviously, in the 1970s, it was written into the textbooks, and then it was also applied not just to jingfang, but to it was systematized in their understanding of warm disease and also in post-classical formulas. Okay, so that's the background, and now we get to the claims, right? The modern.
So why don't we take a small break and we'll reconvene?
Oh, okay. Yep. Sounds good.
And
Sounds good.
And we'll come back. All right. Thank you.
All right. Got it. This means okay. So about these claims, right? So these are claims that we've come across, and this is more or less like the impetus for like why we're having this discussion, right? You there?
Yeah. Sorry, okay. I was nodding. I forgot that you can't see me nodding.
So the first claim, again, we're not gonna name names here in this particular instance.
Yep, these are just
But I
things,
think,
yeah, that we've heard and that we thought, oh,
yeah.
that doesn't sound perhaps quite right, and we think that we might, if other people hear it or if you hear people like they've repeated this claim, then they might be able to say, well, that's not kind of quite right.
Hmm. So I do think it's important to note that this person is a scholar. They are they have a university position as a scholar in Chinese medicine and Chinese medicine history, and they're also a practitioner. So we're holding them to a high standard because they
Well, they're
deserve to
seen
be
as
held.
an authority as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So what was the claim?
The claim, I believe, is that I think it was liver chi stagnation was invented in the 1950s.
Right.
Is
Yeah.
that the first one that we're looking at?
Yeah, to be very fair, yeah, it was just the idea before the 1950s, you would never see in a book something about liver stagnation. Liver stagnation being a pattern, right?
Yeah.
So what do we think about that claim?
Well, I think it might deserve a little bit of nuance in how they think it was played out, because I've gone through and I've looked at a lot of old case studies, and you definitely see liver chi stagnation. Sometimes, it depends how much you want to distinguish between stagnation and you being depression, how or constraint has sometimes
Yeah.
it is translated. But I really think that, yeah, that claim is not right. But and for me, I think you can probably look at it in depending if you want to talk about the use of Xiaoyasan being used for kind of this idea, is that you see, I think around a Ming Dynasty physician called Shuiji. He might have had another name, but I can't quite remember it off the top
Mm.
of my head. But Shui Ji is generally his common name, and if I recall correctly, I think Lorraine Wilcox has translated two of his books, one on
Oh,
on
wow.
gynecology and one on perhaps maybe internal or external damage. I can't quite remember. We'll have to ask her about it. But
Yeah.
if you look through that, you see a lot of use of Xiaoyasan, and I almost think that he was actually the person responsible for bringing Xiaoyasan into such mainstream use.
Okay.
Yeah,
Nice.
you definitely see it then in Wang Ang being used in the book that he wrote, the what do they call it? Yifeng Jijie, like collected commentaries on medical formula, which was around 1690, and he puts Xiaoyasan under the harmonizing category of formula.
Mm.
So even then,
Mm.
you can kind of see that they're already thinking about some form of kind of perhaps liver and spleen or something like that needs to be harmonized, like a Xiaoyang element, perhaps.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So you've done your research on Xiaosan, I can tell.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely. I presented on that formula at our
Right.
national conference this year as well, and I kind of had a little bit of a look at it, but comparing it to Xiao Chai Tang, see where they overlap, see where they're a little bit different as well, and was looking at a little bit of historical uses and commentaries as well. So yeah, I mean, like I think perhaps, if I could offer a little bit of nuance to the person who said this, is that perhaps liver chi stagnation maybe wasn't always framed classically as it was framed now in modern terms. But what I would say is that it definitely existed pre 1950s.
Yeah, and I think actually this person was more or less just giving an example, and what they meant was prior to the 1950s, there was people weren't treating based upon various patterns. So they weren't saying, okay, we have to first identify that this person is kidney in deficient, and then
Mm.
we're gonna give, Liu Wei Di Wan Wan or something. Um, and so I think, this sort of low-hanging fruit, like even if you look in Volkerscheid's medicine contemporary, what's it called? Chinese medicine, contemporary China.
Yeah.
He gives great examples of where you can see this stuff prior to, right? Like
Mm.
in he talks about the Lei Zheng Zhizai. I mean,
Yeah.
I recommend just reading through that chapter. And I think you've also noted some very clear cases of this pattern-based diagnosis as well, right?
Yeah. So, well, this is another little bit of would you say is a claim that they mostly focused on diseases before like the 1950s, the bianzheng movement, is that they're mostly focused on diseases rather than patterns? Is that another claim that you would say?
Well, the second claim is that if we want to get, I think we can, yeah, define again. The second claim is that prior to the 1950s, well, it would actually be like more the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
What happened was you had diseases, and then maybe you had like, you didn't have then like separate patterns underneath.
Yeah.
Was the claim made?
Yeah, that's right. It's an
I'll do that
interesting
one.
idea because I think even like looking at Chinese medicine, I just think that a lot of students still sometimes get a little bit caught up on like pattern, disease, and symptoms. You know, a lot of them, they
Yeah.
might come in and they say, well, what is the disease? And from my understanding of reading well, not even classical text, but I would just say texts throughout the history. They don't have to be classical, but you know, anything kind of from the Huangde Neijing to kind of like pre 1911, like what was the Linjiang Jirsai? You said right, that one.
Yeah, yeah.
Leizhang, sorry, Leizhang. Yeah. And you basically see that the disease for in Chinese medicine is, in my opinion, generally the person's main complaint. Because
Okay.
because you might see something and they might have like abdominal pain or something like that has a disease category, and underneath it they'll have like, oh, you have abdominal pain, like a cough, maybe distension, things like that. But then you have another chapter and you have cough, and then underneath that they might have maybe like fullness of the abdomen, things like that. So you can still see that they have like maybe similar ideas, but they're under different diseases. So it's actually telling you that the main complaint of that person actually, in my opinion, should be your disease category. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you can also see cases where I mean, they're also literally diseases. Like for instance, like think of like in the even like Bing or something
Yeah,
in the Shang'an or Guhuo.
sure,
And
but you
then
got
also
to diagnose that. Okay, yeah. So that is yeah, actually another point. So that you could almost even argue that is a kind of like, yeah, like a syndrome, kind of like and so that's definitely an interesting point where you almost then have like a little bit more kind of like, yeah, complex diseases and kind of almost like then simple like symptoms that might dictate a disease, and then you might have like a series of symptoms that also dictate like almost like a syndrome or disease pattern.
yeah, exactly. And I think this is also to a degree what Volcker is trying to get at a
Yeah.
little bit in his breakdown, is that like, yeah, there's a little bit of gray area between these things, and it's not just clearly that in all cases, like for instance, even in the Shanghanlun, that's all on pattern.
Mm.
There are these like certain like diseases, for instance, like how about, for instance, like sun turmoil or something, right?
Yeah.
Where the person has like vomiting and diarrhea at the same time.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so,
sometimes called cholera.
okay,
That's
yeah.
sometimes the translation that people will use in English.
Yeah, and so there are like, and like you say, but to a degree, these are just like indexes to certain syndromes
Yeah.
or certain symptoms. But then there are also clear cases in the later texts where you have, for instance, like you were saying, like a cough or something, and then they break it down underneath that and they say external cold,
Yep.
external warm,
Yep.
indeficient, blah 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 blah. Yeah, kidney deficiency, right?
Yep. And what they might do is they might just list a formula. For example, in a famous Qing Dynasty physician, Shenjin O, his big work, which kind of, in my opinion, is almost like kind of predates uh, these kind of diagnosis textbooks, is that they'll have a disease and they'll list the formulas like you were saying, and in brackets he'll often put like, yeah, something like for a cold cough or a hot cough or something like that.
Yeah, exactly,
And
exactly.
but then sometimes he doesn't even actually list additional symptoms. It might just be, it's up to you as a physician to figure out, well, what is a hot cough? What is a cold cough? What other signs and symptoms might be associated with this as well? You know, and so there is sometimes in these old books, there is definitely like a barrier to the medicine where you have had to have read a fair bit of material so that you can then actually understand what they're trying to say as well.
Yeah. So there's some ambiguity there. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, to a degree, could almost say that like the bianzheng lunzhi, as it was systematized in the 60s and 70s, there's a degree to which that's kind of nice because, you know, they just put everything out there for you. They show you, okay, so what is that going to mean to what does that mean in terms of symptoms for someone to have like a an exterior warm pattern cough or something like that, you know? And so, yeah, I don't mind that so much, but I think this is like basically Volker Scheid's claim, and the third claim is, yeah, be prior to the 1950s and 1960s. There were diseases, syndromes, symptoms, all kinds of different stuff. Each person had their own way of diagnosing. And then what happened in the like basically by the late 60s is that they really went like hardcore on codifying these patterns, right, in a way that was more systematized than had been before. So
I mean,
yeah.
Well, I mean that's yeah, it's an interesting idea because even then, like, I kind of like look back at the history of Chinese medicine and I always see, I guess, an element of codifying. Like if you look back at the Zhu Bing Yuan Hu Lun, it's basically a whole book that kind of like codifies. But I guess maybe he's arguing that it codifies diseases rather than symptoms.
Codifying patterns.
Patterns. Sorry, yeah, that's right. Yeah. But the thing is, like, to me, if you look at these old books, just because they don't call it a pattern doesn't mean it isn't a pattern. You know, it's almost entirely a pattern, just except for the fact that you haven't called it a pattern.
Well, that's the thing. You know, part of it is just this question of naming. But I think that there is in the 1960s and 70s, as a result of this Renning Chiu, Qin these leading figures, and all of the historical dynamics that we brought up, there's this privilege of place brought onto patterns that it's just not there before.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a fair point by Volker.
Yes. Yeah.
And you know, Volker is also going to acknowledge that even after that, there was still, you know, there's still books that talk about diseases. There's still books that do syndromes and so forth. So,
yeah.
You know, there's still a lot of variety, and I think that's, you know, when Kim Taylor was sort of contrasting like Scheid with Elizabeth Shue, she was kind of saying like Scheid sort of acknowledges this variety. Yeah. And Shue was kind of making this point like, no, like the CCP just like clamped down, and then like after that there was like the one way. But we know that that's not the case, right?
Yep. I agree 100%. It's definitely an interesting idea. I mean, like, I think we spoke about this last time as well, was that like, and I think that we've probably taken a pretty good approach to it, is like where people see like what they did to TCM has like a really, really negative impact on the medicine. But like you said, it's not bad to have something that is all codified, something that is kind of like not necessarily that hard to understand. And I think the other thing I would say is that like the people who wrote like the TCM texts and things like that is that they never intended you to stop at that text. That was just like a gateway into understanding deeper and more intricate ideas of the medicine. But that is a very, very good starting point as well. And I would even say that like some of the texts that are written in Chinese are definitely far superior to that of in English, particularly in the TCM texts as well, where they do sometimes go into a little bit more detail. They will sometimes quote the classics. Like I would say there's a series that has been translated by Paradigm Press the pathomechanism series. And I kind of see that as being very similar to Chinese texts. They'll go through, they'll look at the patterns, and they'll quote Chinese texts that kind of, how do you say, they like back up their stance on what they're saying as well. And
Is that the
sorry?
that the one translated by Wiseman?
No, that's this series I believe was translated all by Sabine Wilms, but
Oh, okay.
was I think perhaps edited by Nigel Wiseman. That recent textbook, I think I actually haven't seen it, so I can't say how much it quotes the classics and things like that. But I think that one is a pretty good textbook, and I would probably say even slightly more, probably more accurate than like Giovanni textbooks and things like that as well. I mean,
Yeah.
if we're talking a little bit about Chinese medical texts, the number one thing I was always tell my students when you're reading a text in English is you have to go to the references first. Because if you don't see Chinese books in the reference list, then the question that immediately should pop up into your head is, where did they get the information from?
Yeah, did they make it up?
Well, if they didn't get it from Chinese books, what English books did they get it from? And did those English books, get it from Chinese? And I mean, and that's the thing that basically you don't have to worry too much about in Chinese literature, because normally, like if they're talking about a formula or something like that, or whenever they quote, they either usually put the author's name or the book, and usually they're quoting relatively famous people and famous books that you see it once and you know what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, for the Shanghai Lun, they might like quote people like Kerchin. If they're looking at formulas, they might look at, Kerchin, Changwu Ji, something like that. More modern formulas, maybe like Qinbo Wei, Wang Ang, things like that, and yeah, Zhao Shude as well, those kind of famous people. So yeah, so that's kind of like the thing is that where I think that like some of these TCM, and perhaps it's just because of how it was transmitted into the West, cops a very, very bad rap when the actual, I think, Chinese standard of TCM and the literature is not, it's really, I think, quite acceptable and quite good. And if we can kind of just see it as like Volker talks about, I guess, as like an evolution of the medicine, it's not that we disregard the past aspects. It's just about, I think, bringing the medicine into a new light and understanding it in a new way as well. And the more ways I think that you can kind of perhaps understand how people spoke about the medicine and codified it themselves, that will give you different approaches into clinic as well.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, sort of like not approaching it with this like very like, oh, this is just, like Western medicinized Chinese medicine, or this is like communist medicine or whatever, and like understanding that like from that second version of the textbooks in China is really held up as an incredible achievement.
Yep.
And so the problem was that what happened was later on we get to the Cultural Revolution, and then in that way a lot of Chinese medicine dialogue was suppressed. And also they went back to Mao's idea of training Western doctors to do Chinese medicine. And so they published these really, really crappy like textbooks. The most famous being an outline of TCM.
Yep.
And that's what Porker translated.
Yep.
So that was the first transmission to the West, was this just like really crappy just
do you know what year that was?
It was in the 70s sometime.
Okay, because if I don't recall, I believe that there was, I think it was like John O'Connor and Bensky and maybe Craig Mitchell or Andrew Ellis, one of those groups of people, they translated a Shanghai textbook as well. And then I can't remember, but not too long after, I believe they did Fundamentals of Chinese Medicine as well, which was very much like the Diwu Ban or the 5th edition Fundamentals as well. And those ones are kind of really held, like people still love those Diwu Ban textbooks, the 5th edition.
Yeah, the DR Ban and the Diwu Ban are considered sort of the crowning achievements.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you got some really famous people who worked on the Diwu Ban. For example, in acupuncture, you have a guy called Yang Jiasan, who was a very
Oh,
famous
yeah,
Beijing acupuncturist as well.
yeah, yeah.
And did Lu Duzhou work on the Shanghan Lun?
I don't know. I actually don't know too much about who was working on those.
Yeah, okay. I'm not. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure who did that one, but yeah, I have a feeling that he might have, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I mean, in general, it's just like the idea that like, these are like pretty good textbooks. And so we shouldn't just kind of like count them out
Mm,
because of all this like anti-communist sentiment or whatever, anti-Western or all these sort of ideas that we hear sort of floating around in the ether.
mm,
Um, but that being said, one thing that I want to share that I thought was kind of interesting is just like in terms of jingfang, because like I'm more into jingfang, um, is that there is a sense in which this what happened in the 20th century really affected the way people study jingfang now. And what I mean by that is it's really gone heavy towards formula pattern.
yep.
Okay, so people are really into, if we look at the names now that are big, you have
Mm,
Huang Huang, you have Hu
yep.
Xishu, you have uh a lot of guys, man, who else? Like for instance, I've been reading Lo Xiaokun, um,
Okay, I haven't heard
and
of him.
you have this Cho. Oh, man. Anyways, I don't want to go. Huang Shipei is another really big one,
Yep.
and so it's all of this, like really getting into the nitty gritty of identifying formula patterns, so which is good stuff.
Mm,
It's very very helpful for clinic, but at the same time, um, there are voices that will push back, like Lika, who says, you still need to understand mechanisms.
yep.
And the thing is that prior to the 1930s, 1940s, mechanisms were still very big. So one
Mm,
story I like to tell, Hu Xishu, who we all know, his first introduction to Shang'anlun was what? Tang Zonghai, right? And so
yeah.
this was like the mechanism school. This had nothing to do with formula pattern,
Can,
right?
can,
And
can we
so
just have a quick introduction about Tang Zonghai? Because he is we've been talking about a couple of beasts in Chinese medicine, but Tang Zonghai, he is really almost on his own level.
right. Yeah.
He was, if I recall, Alan said he was, I think, one of three. Is it Jinsher? Is Jinsher the correct way to say it?
就是, yeah.
Which is like the highest level of imperial examination you can do. And
Yeah.
the only other two, I think, was it Shu Wei, something like that, that a 12th century Shanghanlun
That's
specialist.
right.
And
Acupuncture. Yeah, yeah.
and the other one was Wang Kanting, who was a 16th century kind of just insanely prolific author as well. But
Yeah,
so
and so
this gives us an idea of the type of kind of intelligent person that we're dealing with. There's only been kind of like three of these people in the last 1,000 years who've studied Chinese medicine.
and gone on to be a jinsi or
Yeah.
were a jinsi.
Yeah.
And so I mean, that was like a very, very prominent school. Like I think Chen Xiuyuan and Tang Zonghai were probably some of the most highly thought of. And so with the 20th century, and probably to a big degree because of Campo, but obviously you also have like Shu Da Chun,
Mm,
Shu Da Chun, and other people who did stuff with formula pattern going back.
yep.
Um, but like that really got erased in the 20th century to a degree, and you only have very few people still doing that stuff now. And it was interesting because I was having this discussion with a former teacher of mine who studied under Nihai Xia.
Mm,
Um, and Nihai Xia is he's in that tradition of Tang Zonghai and this like understanding mechanisms as and the way that the body is functioning as opposed to looking at just symptoms and formula patterns.
mm,
And he sort of like gave me like a smackdown because like I was like talking all these like formula patterns. He was like, yeah, but if you really want to get into the detail, like you still have to understand the mechanism at work here.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, right. Because in Taiwan, that formula pattern school is not that
Prolific,
it's
perhaps.
yeah, it's not that common. And so and Nihai didn't really work that way.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. Yeah, I think that's part of like the what I kind of want to bring to Jingfang in the West too is just more of that perspective, that like mechanism perspective, because I really like formula pattern, but I do see where it's lacking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, I think it's yeah. I really I think that'll be a great addition to the study of Jingfang as well. And I think as well, like the more like there have been so many great and famous authors throughout Chinese medicine history, and I really think that yeah, even prior to the 1900s, everyone was kind of having their own take on it as well. And even like you could say even Huang Yanyu was a little bit kind of like mechanism, just looking at it through the body as well, of the five zhang and the six qi as well, you know.
Oh yeah. Oh
And,
yeah. 100%. Yeah.
and I mean the thing is, you hear about people talk about five phases or five elements, and for me, someone like Huang Yanyu is actually, he really embodies what I would say the true five elements of Chinese medicine as well.
Yep.
He
Yep.
really understood five phases immaculately.
Yeah, and he's definitely had something of a bit of a renaissance, I'd say,
Yeah.
in China of late as well. I think people are really a lot of people read his stuff now, and it's not suppressed in China, folks. You can still talk about that.
Do
Yeah.
you think that's thanks to perhaps a little bit of Li Ke, and who was that other very famous circular motion guy?
Pengzi,
Peng Yize?
Pengzi.
Peng Ziyi. I always mix up the Yize or the Ziyi.
Yeah, yeah.
Because he was quite a big fan of Huang Lanyu. What about Zheng Qinan? Was he a fan of Huang Lanyu?
He doesn't really bring him up, no.
Okay. So maybe it's more of the Peng Ziyi guy.
Yeah, who is also from Dali. He's also from the Southwest.
Ah, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Have you been to
Um,
Dali?
I have been, yes.
Yeah, same. It's really nice there.
Yeah, beautiful place.
Yeah.
Although a little bit touristic now, I've heard,
Okay.
but it was nice 10 years ago.
Yeah, I went in about 2012 as well, when I was living in China as well.
What? That was like a year after I went. Well, we
Yeah.
almost caught up with each other.
How
Yeah.
about that? Yeah, but yeah, if you guys get a chance to kind of go to the south of China, it is really beautiful. You have Dali, Lijiang,
Right.
Guilin, and then
Yeah.
if you can get over to Huangshan, then that's also a really beautiful place as well.
And a lot of interesting medicine going on there, between the Hosampai and
Mm,
like Pengzi traditions and stuff like that. There's a lot of good stuff.
yeah. All right. Is there
Well,
anything else that you want to talk about today, Will? I mean, we've kind of gone a little bit all over the place, and we've discussed a bit of history, a couple of controversial topics, and
yeah.
I would just say, if you guys are really interested in learning more about this stuff, then definitely check out Volker's work and Kim Taylor's work. You can't go
Yeah.
wrong with those ones if you really
Yeah.
want to know.
Definitely. Definitely.
And I
Top
guess,
notch.
we're not out to really kind of try and prove one wrong here. We're just trying to add maybe a little bit of nuance to some of the things that people might have said, so that they don't get taken, I guess, incorrectly, or get taken to an extreme as well.
Right. Yep.
Because we
Yep.
really do have great respect for the work that these people are doing, and that they kind of continue to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And sometimes there's just so much nuance to it, right? That it's hard for nuance to get translated into sort of like general discussion, right?
Mm.
You end up getting like talking points, sort of like in the news or something.
It's like, like even just like sometimes like one statement, you could write a paper or more on that, but
Yeah,
you just it's not like your main topic or what you really want to focus on, but there's still so much depth and information about it. And this is one of the things that just that I love about Chinese medicine, is that there's just so much depth to almost every aspect of the medicine, about whatever you want to research, about whatever you want to read about. there's just so much there that you can kind of discover and learn. And how many other fields have 2,000 years worth of literature that you can kind of
Huh,
look at? It just
yeah,
amazes me.
right.
It's
Yeah.
truly one of the most. We are so lucky to be living in this age that we have access to all this information about it.
Right. Yeah, it's like a kid in a candy store when you go on see text.
Oh yeah, or even the Jicheng website is another one that we use, and
Right.
they just,
Yeah.
like
Same.
they have hundreds of books of there in Chinese, and it just, it is really incredible. And I mean, the other really good thing, if you guys are listening to this, if you're students or something like that, and you're kind of questioning, should I learn Chinese or something like that, what I would say is that I would really encourage it, because one of the things with learning Chinese is like, if you have a question about Chinese medicine, is probably very likely that someone else in history throughout history has also had that question. And if you can read
Yeah,
Chinese, then there's probably a good chance that you can find an answer to that question as well.
definitely. Yeah.
Because yeah, the amount of people, yeah, in Chinese medicine, the intelligence and things like that, they would have probably looked to answering kind of these kind of questions that you might think up as well. And or you might just, like, knowing Chinese is definitely almost like a cheat code when you want to research something like that. You might want to say, oh, I want to look at the spleen
Really.
in the Neijing. Bam, you can just go find all the entries to the spleen, the liver, things like that. It
Or look
really.
at modern research, with like on, there's tons of articles that people have already written on that stuff as well.
Yeah, yeah. It really. So if you guys are listening to this, and you're liking what you've been listening to, and you're thinking, where should I go after I've studied Chinese medicine? Then I think Will and I, we both learnt Chinese, and I think it would be, yeah, we really encourage you guys to learn Chinese if you can have the time and the ability to do so.
Saves on books too, right? Just
Uh,
get right on the text and
well, I mean, even buying Chinese copies of literature, like you can probably
yeah,
buy about, like books in China, maybe anywhere between 10 to $15 US, something like that. So, you can
yeah,
probably buy about 5 Chinese books for one book in English.
exactly, yeah.
So it's good.
And
It's
you're
good.
getting the primary source.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Exactly, exactly. All right. Well, any final thoughts for this lovely discussion that we've been having?
Hopefully, we put up on Facebook, we get a little discussion going. Even if you disagree with us, don't worry. We got thick skin.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, I think we would encourage you guys to have this discussion with us as well, because we're not perfect. We'll make mistakes as well, and I think it's
You
nice
do.
if we can kind of, if we've said something that perhaps people don't agree with, that we can discuss it, figure out that nuance that we've kind of been looking at for other people as well, and ultimately that benefits everyone as well.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having this talk with me, Will. It's always a pleasure, man. I always, we always
Indeed.
have, whether they're recorded or unrecorded, I always really appreciate having chats about Chinese medicine with you. I always look forward to it. Yeah, I feel very lucky. So thank you very much.
Very eye-opening. And thank you for everyone listening here to this episode of Locus Classicus.
And we'll be back soon, and hopefully we're going to be bringing you guys a great guest. So you're probably
Yeah,
bored of us too, so we'll bring someone in to mix it up.
yeah, exactly. Get some fresh faces in.
Yeah. All right. You guys have a lovely day or evening wherever you are, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye bye.